Nothing was officially said. Not because there was nothing to say, and not because the situation resolved itself. Nothing was officially said, because the moment didn't require a statement to continue. There was no meeting, no explicit agreement, no clear exchange that marked the transition from one understanding to another. Things simply moved forward, without being named. At first, this felt harmless, even considerate. Saying something would have introduced formality. It would have fixed the moment in language, given it edges, made it accountable. By not saying anything, we preserved flexibility. No one had to commit. No one had to contradict. No one had to explain what they were prepared to do or not do. Nothing was officially said, and that silence passed as neutrality, the absence of words, was mistaken for the absence of consequence. We continued interacting, as if an understanding existed, even though it had never been articulated. The situation didn't collapse. No confusion surfaced immediately, which made the lack of clarification feel justified. If clarity had been necessary, I told myself, it would have made itself known. But necessity often arrives quietly. Nothing was officially said, so nothing could be referenced later. There was no sentence to return to, no phrasing to revisit. Without language, there was no record of intent. This made everything easier in the short term. Disagreements could be avoided, because nothing concrete existed to disagree with. Expectations remained adjustable. Boundaries remained implied rather than stated. Implied things are light. They don't demand maintenance. They don't ask to be defended. At the time, this lightness felt efficient. We didn't have to slow down. We didn't have to stop and define anything. Momentum carried us forward, without interruption. Nothing was officially said, and the world didn't object, which reinforced the idea that saying something had never been necessary. Over time, the unsaid began to do work. Assumptions filled the space, where clarification might have been. Each person carried their own version of what had been agreed upon, even though no agreement had occurred. The differences were subtle at first, small enough to ignore, easy to rationalize as misunderstanding, or timing, or individual interpretation. Nothing felt urgent enough to require correction. Silence had become the default state. I noticed how often I relied on that silence, how convenient it was to avoid committing to language. Words create reference points. They allow alignment, but they also allow misalignment to become visible. By saying nothing, we postponed that visibility. Nothing was officially said, so there was no moment to point to when things began to diverge. There was no origin of difference, only gradual drift. Drift is difficult to challenge. It doesn't present itself as a problem. It just alters distance over time. I told myself that explicit statements can be unnecessary, that not everything needs to be formalized, that people can understand one another without documentation. Sometimes that's true, but understanding that isn't expressed relies heavily on consistency, and consistency is fragile when nothing has been defined. Nothing was officially said, so expectations evolved independently. Each adjustment felt reasonable in isolation. Each shift could be justified without referencing a shared framework. There was no shared framework, only parallel interpretations that happened to coexist. For a while, that coexistence held. Then small discrepancies appeared, not confrontational ones, just moments where responses didn't align with what I had assumed. These moments were easy to dismiss. No one had technically been wrong. No promise had been broken, because nothing had been promised. Nothing was officially said, and that made accountability difficult to locate. There was no clear moment where something could be addressed. Raising the issue would have required introducing formality after the fact. Why bring this up now? Why make something explicit that had been allowed to remain undefined? That question discouraged intervention. It felt simpler to continue as we were. Silence is persuasive. It suggests that nothing is wrong, simply because nothing has been stated. I mistook that absence of declaration for stability. Over time, the lack of official language began to shape behavior. Certain topics remained unspoken. Certain expectations were quietly reduced, not out of disappointment, but out of practicality. It was easier to adjust internally than to request external clarification. Nothing was officially said, so nothing had to be renegotiated. The cost of that convenience was subtle, not loss, but ambiguity. Ambiguity that couldn't be resolved. because there was no starting point. I realized then that official statements don't just clarify outcomes. They clarify responsibility. They establish where intention lives. Without them, intention becomes interpretive. I had assumed that shared understanding would naturally maintain itself. But understanding without articulation is vulnerable to erosion. Nothing was officially said, and eventually, the lack of definition became the definition. The relationship, the situation, the arrangement continued in a state of quiet provisionality, not temporary, but never confirmed. This state didn't feel unstable. It felt adaptable. But adaptability has limits. When conditions changed, there was no agreed-upon language to return to, no original terms to reference, only the present moment, bearing the weight of all that had never been specified. I don't believe everything needs to be formal. I still don't. Some moments benefit from openness. Some connections thrive on flexibility. But I've learned that flexibility, without articulation, can slowly transform into uncertainty. Nothing was officially said, and that silence seemed to keep things smooth. It avoided friction. It preserved momentum, but it also delayed alignment. By the time alignment became necessary, there was nothing concrete to align around. Nothing was officially said, and that absence became the quiet force that shaped what followed. Not through intention, but through omission. Only later did I understand that silence isn't neutral when it replaces clarity. It simply postpones it, and postponements, when left unexamined, tend to become structure. Nothing was officially said, and that, more than any statement, defined the outcome.